Hey everybody, good evening.
Good evening.
So today we'll be discussing a piece of literature from history. It's a letter from Birmingham Jail. So I know a little bit about it, but I wanted to hear you guys' inputs on it first. So what's the background of this letter from Birmingham Jail, if anybody would like to elaborate? John.
So Martin Luther, from what I'm aware of, Martin Luther King Jr. was recently arrested for peacefully protesting. And so he was actually in jail in the Birmingham jail and decided, since he has so much time, he's going to write a letter to his kind of like his opponents addressing that his grievances with the peaceful protests, these people that aren't really supporting him. And so he's basically reading the letter writing a letter why his protests are justified and why it's kind of backed by God and religion and everything like that.
Okay. And throughout this letter, what argument did you find most compelling? And this is open not to just John, but kind of everybody.
I think it's his approach to the letter. You see, he basically didn't do anything wrong. He was peacefully protesting, right? But just his approach he came towards the letter, it's kind of in a forgiving tone.
I know. I personally found it interesting where he was being very open and forgiving. He wasn't necessarily being weak either. He was being very direct too, and he's saying here are the issues, here are the people that I'm calling out, and here's who's kind of responsible. So forgiving and inviting to debate and to talk, but also not scurrying away from the real meat of the issue. Kind of taking it on.
I think what's really interesting about this letter is that nowadays when we talk about Martin Luther King, we talk about him in a positive light. He's seen as the symbol of peace and kind of justice, but in this time period in which he wrote this letter, he was seen as a quote unquote terrorist. And so what similarities do you see with current events with what Martin Luther King went through in the 1960s? What notable celebrity or figure?
I mean, with Nelson Mandela. So, for instance, when Nelson Mandela, he was viewed as a terrorist in South Africa. They told him as a terrorist. The United States, he was the CIA was after him. That's how they even call him, right? But after a while, after he got released, he was held by the hero. The United States praised him. He was given several awards and being this great figure, it's how it changed over time, just that.
Did you guys have anything to say?
Absolutely. What exactly was the question?
So I know that for me, one thing that I've always learned throughout literature, kind of through history, is that history repeats itself, right? So I know, in current times, for instance, Colin Kaepernick right now, he's been criticized for and been called a quote unquote terrorist or patriotic because of his actions, and I'm kind of seeing similarities between his actions and kind of Martin Luther King's actions because just because of how they went about the protest, they both went about it very peacefully, and even though there are people who may disagree with their position, and it's fascinating to me how in about 30 years or 40 years from now, people are going to be praising Colin Kaepernick when 2 or 3 years ago, people burned his jerseys, people hated him.
Yeah.
And it's just really interesting. I see the parallels.
And that kind of example is really interesting because I know specifically with Martin Luther King, the governor of the state at the time was very heavily involved in the goings on, and with Colin Kaepernick, you have the president of the United States who, in my opinion, should be doing other things, but here he is kind of wading into the waters of one player's peaceful protest, and that one was really unique because. And I think you're dead on with the parallels between it because that's one player using the only platform that he feels that he has, a way that he feels he can get his voice heard, and he's doing it, not affecting anyone else, not getting in anyone else's way. He's just silently protesting by himself, and yet here's all this visceral hate against him. So I find that really interesting. The similarities between the two.
Okay. And this is also another interesting tip because I think throughout history and kind of throughout the civil rights movement, we always hear about Martin Luther King, but we don't hear about Malcolm X, we hear about the Black Panther Party. So why do you guys think that's true? We hear about Martin Luther King a lot. We have statues dedicated to him. We have memorials dedicated to him. He's written throughout the history books, but we don't hear about the other prominent figures in the civil rights movement.
I mean, personally, I feel like Martin Luther King, the reason that out of this time period we hear the most about Martin Luther King is because it's like almost a way for white people who were perpetrating the problem at the time to kind of feel good or better about themselves. It's almost like a feel-good story for ourselves. Whereas Malcolm X or the Black Panther movement, they really highlight a lot of the issues and some of the racial relations and really kind of point fingers and bring light to more intense issues. Martin Luther King is all about this issue where, oh, here's a guy and they're getting persecuted, but he was super peaceful and never fought back. Oh, and then in the end, he won, and the white people, they kind of realized what they were doing, and now everyone's friends and everything's perfect and everything's fine. So I think it's almost kind of like a pseudo-romanticized version of events where Martin Luther King is held up to a higher standard than some of these other figures because it almost allows white people to feel better or feel redemption about themselves where that might not exactly align with history.
It gives like them a better image like of their role, I guess they play, because like when it comes to what you call it, Malcolm X and the Black Panther, like what the action they did to them, like the stuff they actually like talked about, like it's like very like emotional, very sentimental, like, and it's just like talking about that part is just like more uncomfortable to like most than like going to the Malcolm Luther King route. So I guess that's why it's like more like taught in school, more encouraged, I guess, like, and stuff like that.
Also, I think probably religion had at least something to do with it. I mean, Martin Luther King was Catholic, right?
Yes.
Catholic priest. Well, Malcolm X was Islamic, right? And so I think like that is more palpable, especially in today's kind of current environment.
Okay. And then what lessons could we draw from like the whole like argument of this essay slash like what argument could we draw from this letter? Because right now in our current times we face a lot of issues. There's a lot of protests going on. It's a lot going on, just to like simply put it. So what lessons could we take from this in particular? Do you think that like violence / non-violence is the answer to engage in peaceful protests? Or?
I think with this, like, it's just like self-evident in a way, like the test, like he, like the way they treated him, like the way he like kept his cool, like was like really calm about stuff, and the way he was very invited to his like people who were telling him to like throw him in jail, like no, come out, like the way he addressed them and the way just he went about the whole like situation. It's something we could use in our daily life. Like we should be like more forgiving. We should be more inviting of our enemies and stuff like that. So it's like very profound, like the way he addressed the problem.
I think Martin Luther King. Oh, sorry. What do you want to say?
Oh, no, I was going to say, I think definitely this argument definitely kind of like stands the test of time. Like, he kind of comes off as like, oh, I haven't, he really didn't do anything wrong. He's just exercising the same rights that like a lot of prolific figures like the founding fathers did to the British. He's kind of doing that same non-violent protest where he's not doing anything illegal. He's doing everything he's doing is perfectly legal, like perfect. Like all the protests, never, no harm was done except to the protesters themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So now when we kind of look back on this in history, all the protesters were just innocent people, and everyone who fought against the civil rights movement are now kind of like seen mostly in the wrong. They're actually entirely in the wrong since since they really cause a lot of harm to people who are just fighting for their freedom. So I think, basically to sum it up, nonviolent protest is definitely something that we value more in American history than.
And I think he offers like a really interesting kind of like potent template for, how to stage protests nowadays, nonviolent protests. And I find it really interesting to see kind of like how people nowadays kind of like parlay his experience into like, more modern needs and how do we protest in more of a modern time. Like, I just think like we're on a college campus now and it's, I don't particularly agree with it, but there's the boycott, divest, and sanction of the Israel group. And it's just interesting where, it's the same kind of nonviolent principles that you take from Dr. King, but it's like, how do we kind of reinvent these and change them to fit a more modern area? So you have, people calling for like schools to make sure that our endowment isn't invested in certain issues that people don't agree with, or we only invest in renewable energies. We don't hold any shares of like oil. So I think he kind of laid the groundwork for being really inventive and finding a lot of different ways to have a great effect while still committing to nonviolence.
Well, thank you guys for participating in the discussion. Unfortunately, I have to cut this lecture short because this topic can go on for like hours and hours. But again, thank you guys for participating in this discussion. And this is something that I think this discussion needs to be happening on all college campuses, not just at George Washington University. And yeah, thank you guys again.
Thank you.
Thank you.